Hi, I'm Richard West. I'm from the bands Oblivion Protocol and Threshold, and you're watching Sonic Perspectives.
Richard West is probably best known as the keyboardist, composer, and background vocalist for the British prog-metal band Threshold. But he's about to be known for a different project that he's put together, the band called Oblivion Protocol. The album is called Fall of the Shires, and it will be out on August 18th. I'm Mark Boardman, and this is Sonic Perspectives, and we welcome Richard West to our show today. Richard, I hope all is well.
Hi, Mark. All is well, thanks. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. Legends of the Shire. Let's go back just a little bit to Legends of the Shires, which was an album that Threshold did back in 2017. Tell us a bit about the story about how that album led to Oblivion Protocol.
Oh, okay. So Legends of the Shires was a concept album. It kind of had this dual story. It was partly about a nation kind of growing up and finding itself, and partly about a person doing pretty much the same thing. We got quite a lot of fan comments back on it, how people really related to parts of the story. So I was quite keen to do a sequel. And I think it was when we were out on tour the following year, 2018, I came up with a story for the sequel called The Fall of the Shires. And I wrote the opening song, which became the full part one. And so when we started making a new Threshold record, I suggested it to the guys, and I thought that's what we were going to do the new sequel. But halfway through the record, they all kind of had a bit of a change of heart, or a couple of them did. So we kind of went a different way. We made this album Dividing Lines, which came out great. But it left me with this story and this opening song. I had a closing song by then. And I don't like unfinished stuff. So I kind of thought, well, I'm just going to finish the record anyway, make it just for myself. So I kind of made this thing. I thought no one would ever hear it. I gave it the name Oblivion Protocol, which basically means the protocol for this record is to consign it to oblivion. It's for it to be, it genuinely was it for it to be heard by nobody and be known about by nobody. But I just happened to be chatting to a friend at a record company one day, and he asked what I was doing, so I mentioned it, and he said, "Well, send me a copy." And then next thing I know, I'm being signed. So it's the accidental band making the accidental album is probably the subtitle for this one.
And now the title of the band is ironic, if nothing else.
Absolutely, yes. But it's kind of a cool one. I like it.
Yeah, it is a cool name. Well, you talk about how Threshold began recording this, basically, and then people sort of had different ideas about where they wanted to go. Are there tapes somewhere of Threshold playing, say, part of The Fall?
No, that'd be nice, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would.
No, so the way we work, we all make our demos separately, and it was while we were at the demo stage. So they all had copies of the full part one and part two, and we had a lot of the other songs coming in. It's interesting, a lot of the Threshold songs we had, like Hall of Echoes, that was part of the story. Defense Condition was part of the story. Tormented was part of the story. Oh, that is one of mine. Haunted was part of the story. It's hard. I get confused between the two because they're all part of the story for me. So there's a lot of crossover. But it's fine. Threshold went one way. I think when you're in a band, you find a direction that works for everybody. And that's what we did. So got no complaints. But it gave me this great opportunity to do something else. So it worked out quite well.
Yeah, I was wondering because I listened to Defense Condition a lot. I like that song a great deal. But the more I listened to it and the more I listened to Oblivion Protocol, I'm going, this could work on either album, as a matter of fact. And I guess it could have.
It would have done. I'll probably write an essay one day about how they all actually weave together to tell the full story. But that'd be quite boring to do an interview form, so I won't bore you with that one.
But we'll take it as being fact that in fact I wasn't wrong that that particular song could have fit in to Oblivion Protocol.
Yeah, that was actually planned to be the halfway point of the story.
It was.
Which funnily enough, would have then been followed by silence. You get this massive kind of sound at the end where the king starts to kill off all the people. And then
yes.
So yeah, out of the noise, you get the word silence coming out. I had a whole story planned, but it doesn't matter. It's all worked out beautifully anyway.
But the story that you put on to Fall of the Shires is somewhat different than the one you'd originally planned.
It's probably more focused than we'd have done with Threshold, because I think when you've got different people writing, it's very hard to stick to a very narrow brief, and you end up sort of spreading out a little bit. So, so when I realised that I was doing it myself, I just had that opportunity just to pull it in and say, well, really, what is the story, and just refine it a bit. So again, all worked out well.
When you're working with Threshold, you work to a certain extent with Carl Groom, the guitarist, in putting together songs. How many of the songs that you do with Threshold are strictly yours?
Oh, I couldn't put a number on it. Around half, I would say.
Okay.
I think on a very, looking back, certainly since John Jittery left, who used to write Carl's lyrics for him up until about 2002, I think since then, it's either been me writing or me and Carl writing together. I split that about 50-50. And then you get the odd other songwriter coming in. We've had Pete and Damien from our old lineup used to write the occasional song. Glyn's writing more and more. So he wrote 3 on Dividing Lines. Fantastic songs. So that's taken the pressure off me and Carl a bit. We've got another writer in now, which is nice.
Yeah. So you're comfortable writing, well, in a slightly different mode, writing for a different band and writing for a different situation then.
Oh, absolutely. I think when I started making the Oblivion Protocol album, I just thought, well, what do I want to hear? You know, I genuinely thought no one would ever hear it. So it's one of those rare moments. I remember I used to paint and I was terrible at it. But when I suddenly started painting, thinking, what if I paint something that no one will ever see? I actually came up with something really good because suddenly there was no pressure on me. And I found the same with Oblivion Protocol. It was like total freedom because no one's going to hear it. So I thought, well, what works for my voice? What sounds do I want to hear that I like Threshold? What do I want to hear that's different from Threshold? And I kind of build up my own palette and template. And it was a really liberating way to write. So yeah, absolutely loved every minute of it.
For those who are not familiar with it, and you should be familiar with Threshold and these albums because they're very, very stunning. Can you tell us a little bit about the first album and the story behind it, or the story within it? It's a pretty powerful story. As you said, there were people who wanted a sequel to it.
I think the story, like I say, it's really about a person just trying to find themselves, trying to find where they belong in the world. So they go through these ups and downs. And I think different aspects of the story people have identified with. You know, when he's going through hard times, I think people have really picked up on that and seen that there's redemption and hope at the end. And it's kind of one of those things you just lock onto if you're going through that sort of thing in life, I suppose. And then at the end of the story, he's kind of stopped doing what he used to do, and he's given all these options. So if you know the song Lost in Translation, there's a soft section in the middle where you get these lyrics, maybe a writer, maybe a king, a star, a fighter, and there are all these various options of what he could do next. So I thought, oh, I could do a sequel for each one of those. But actually, some of them would be less interesting than others. I think one was maybe a clerk. I'm not sure I could do a whole album about being a clerk.
Probably not.
But I thought maybe a king. Yeah, there's definitely a story there. So the Fall of the Shires, he becomes the king. And I remember when I came up with the concept, this idea that he's the king and he's given a difficult decision straight away. And I took a line from the first song of Legends where it's about learning how to tame the weeds. So I took that as controlling the land, but basically how to control the population. And he wants to work out a way just to control the population, which is a pretty contentious issue right now. Yes. It wasn't so much when I wrote it, but it's funny how the world works. And I just thought that's a really dark story. I'm not sure I want to go there. But once I started writing it, it was quite compelling. So I found I had quite a lot to say on that.
I thought it was interesting because Lost in Translation is a very compelling song. It's a very powerful song. It's a powerful way to end an album, except it doesn't end the album. Swallowed does, which is a lot more mild and mellow, and yet it's a bit more cynical about taking in everything that comes your way potentially. And it references not only sort of the ecology, but human beings taking in thoughts as well. And I'm going, that's interesting. It's sort of like, here's the great thing. This guy's got all these options, but he might just swallow the wrong stuff. Was that what your thinking was, or am I off base again?
No, you're probably on base. It's been a while, to be honest. I haven't revisited that as my homework for the interview. But I certainly that song "Swallowed" was one of the first ones I wrote for Legends, and I kind of knew if that was going on the record, it would be like an epilogue. It was like a little postscript at the end. So I think you're right. Legends, Lost in Translation is the big ending, but then you get this little postscript at the end, and that was the idea.
And yet, Swallowed in a way, because it does delve into that, does really link things pretty well with the second album, with the Oblivion Protocol album, because you've got a king here, and he would want people to swallow whatever he's tossing out before he has to take the big step and put the foot down on everybody.
You should be my consultant for writing concept songs. I never even thought of that one. That's a great link. Maybe I'll steal that for the next sequel.
You could do that. I am paid by the hour if you want to know. I overthink these things, unfortunately. That's the danger of being a prog fan occasionally, is that you get into these things and, oh, I'm adding this up and I'm adding this up. And half the time you ask the artist about that and they're going, what the heck are you talking about? I have no idea.
I'd say you're not wrong, but I hadn't actually thought of that particular connection. But thematically, you're right. That's what's going on.
Now, perhaps I'm assuming that there are some people who are watching this who are not familiar with Threshold. And again, you should be, but mentioning Shires is going to be dangerous, because automatically a certain number of people will start thinking about Lord of the Rings, and this is not the Lord of the Rings.
This is not the Lord of the Rings. I think the word Shire, I think it's actually got a German root to it, but it's a very much an English word the way we use it. Most of our regions or counties, as we call them, are Devonshire, Shropshire. A lot of them are just got Shire at the end of them. So it feels like a very English word. And I think when I was writing the original story, it was really the story of a nation was what I was starting off with. But that's a pretty dull title for an album. So I thought, well, instead of story, we're going to go with Legends, and instead of nation, going to go with Shires. And suddenly you've got a rather better sounding album title. So that's really the concept of it.
Yeah.
And we're a British band, so it's nice to have that British reference to it.
The Shire being just a geographical section of land. Well, as a matter of fact, we've got the state of New Hampshire, so it's used over here as well.
But yeah, I think our counties are like your states in terms of we have. So similar thing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there are no hobbits were involved in the making.
No hobbits at all. This king, who could have been a writer, could have been a clerk, could have been a whole lot of different things, chooses the kingship, and it doesn't seem, the crown does not fit well upon him. He doesn't understand the nuances of power. He understands how you can use it to get power and to maintain it for a while, but he really doesn't understand how you use it to get people, I don't know, to cooperate on their own volition. Is that part of what you were getting across, that governments are not doing a good job of that?
No, I wasn't trying to have a political commentary. There's a lot of commentators out there that do that sort of thing. I'm a songwriter and a storyteller, and for me this was telling a story. And really I wrote most of this before the whole COVID thing happened as the initial concept, so there wasn't really a link with what's going on today and what people are saying. But I think as you write, obviously you get influenced by what's going on around you, so you'll see lots of familiar themes in there. I think all good fiction is rooted in reality. It's what makes it relatable. So there's certainly connections in there, I'd say. But I think that my premise of the story really is the king's given an impossible question: how do you reduce the population? And the answer is you shouldn't. It's not your job. But he decided that it was his job, and therefore he ends up getting his advisors to come back with all the possible solutions. And he says yes to all, and that's how the story starts. And then you just see how that affects him, how that affects the people, and then you will hopefully see how it affects him at the end of the story and into the next story, where he'll become something else. But that's a story for another time.
As a storyteller, do you intend to have a message within there, or just accept the story as it is?
My personal view at the moment, and I'll probably change with every album I write, is that I write a story as a vehicle to then explore various topics and themes. So it gives you that opportunity, a bit like when you decide I'm going to write a progressive metal album. It gives you a chance to write heavy riffs, to write atmospheric sections, big solos, time changes. It just opens you up to this wonderful palette, which is such a great place to be composing in. And I think, again, with a story, it's not just because you're telling a story, but you get all these opportunities to explore what's the hope element of this story, what's the real tragedy element of this story, how does it feel on a human level? And that's what I like, exploring the emotions behind things, and hopefully finding stories of hope in among the hard times.
Does the story come first or the message come first?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah,
or the egg.
For me here, it's story or message. I think story first, because you've got to work out what your vehicle is that you're then going to use to put in all the messages, I suppose. So in this instance, the story came first. I had this idea of the king and saying yes to all. So that was my initial concept, and then I fleshed it out from there. I mapped out where I wanted the story to go. So I think I had an answer after all.
Yes, you do. When you come up with a story, though, is it pretty easy for you as a musician then to find the music that goes along with each part of that story, or is that something you have to ponder a bit?
It's easier for me than it is for my wife, because I do a lot of the writing when we're on holiday, and we go for nice long walks across the cliffs in Cornwall. It's a beautiful part of the country. And I just get lost in my head, and we suddenly find we haven't spoken to each other for a couple of hours. And then I suddenly say something, and she says, "Oh, are you back?" So much easier for me than it is for her. But I think most musicians are the same. But I just live and breathe this stuff, so it's going around my head all day long for days and weeks and months. So is it easy? Yes, but it takes forever because I'm constantly adapting and changing things in my head. The song Forest and the Fallout, which was the first single, I actually wrote 3 totally different versions of that song before I was happy with it. So I take the long way home, to quote another Threshold title.
Well, I was wondering, do you, while you're going through those things, do you have versions of songs that sort of go off in a different direction that you go, okay, I'm not using that for this, but I think maybe I could use that for something else in the future?
Yes, that quite often happens, and quite often that'll become the seed for another song. Yeah, that's quite common. In fact, on Legends of the Shires, when I wrote Stars and Satellites, I had so many pieces of music left at the end, I used them to make the song Subliminal Freeways. So it happens sometimes. And certainly with Forest and the Fallout, the first version I did was a much longer song, a lot more progressive, and it had lots of really nice bits in it. So I'm sure they'll get revisited at some point.
In one of your interviews, it was just a blurb really that was put out by the record company, and you're talking about how you'd been into pop music and you understood that to some extent, but then you were introduced to Queen and Genesis and those kinds of bands and saw the possibilities of expanding from a 3-minute pop song. Hello, we lost. There we are.
Sorry.
No, if you saw the possibilities of expanding from a 3-minute pop song on up to who knows what else it could be based on what prog will allow. Interestingly enough, this particular album of Oblivion Protocol, the longest song is 6 minutes. So it's not like you were taking any particular part musically. And taking it out a lot. Was there a reason behind that? Were you
I was
looking
torn. So when I started making it, and I'll go back to the fact that I was just making it for myself, I thought I would love to just make it and press one copy of the album. You know, you can press it, it's not on proper vinyl, it's on some sort of other material, I can't remember what. But I thought that's my dream, I'll just make one copy of this. So I think I'd already set myself the idea that it had to be 22 or 23 minutes on each side, and that was it. So that was my template. So that's probably primarily the reason the songs are so much shorter than some of the threshold epics. Because a song like Forest and the Fallout, it feels to me like a 10-minute song that I cut down and made it really tight and compact, but it still goes to all the places that I'd normally take a 10-minute song. Mm-hmm. But it's just an edited version of a long song, if you know what I mean.
But I would think that particular exercise is not a bad thing either. When you're putting together a longer song, then you can go back and say, you know, should it be this long, or should I edit it down to be more compact and maybe something a little easier for the listener to take in?
It's the age-old question for prog, isn't it? I know Genesis went through that. They started cutting things shorter and shorter. And actually the first Genesis album I heard was And Then Number 3. And that was the one where they said, right, we're going to cut off all the fat. And I actually fell in love with that record. And for me, that was prog. I didn't know the older stuff at the time. Because even though the songs were tighter and more compact than their older stuff, they were still had that progressive concept to them. They were going off in directions they wanted to go. And they had this beautiful sound that, as you mentioned earlier, I wasn't hearing in 3-minute pop songs on the radio. They just had something else. And that's what inspired me. And Queen, you mentioned the other band, they didn't really do many songs up to the 8 or 10 minute mark. But what they did was so far out there in terms of what you can fit into those 3 or 4 minutes. And that's what's always inspired me. So I love the long songs, but I love the short songs if they've got a lot of substance to them as well.
Yeah. You're growing up in the 70s. You're about 55 now. So I guess you would have been growing up in the 70s. What pop music were you listening to on the radio?
I discovered pop music in about 78. I think the first single I got was Don't Stop Me Now by Queen. So it's a good way to... I had My Life by Billy Joel was one of my early ones as well. And it was really what was ever in the top 40 after that. It took a few years before I discovered there were albums as well as singles. I was lived in a little village. We didn't have record shops. So I just had access to very little. My parents were very much into classical music. So that was my initial inspiration growing up. You know, I was surrounded by Chopin and Beethoven. So pop music came to me a bit later in life.
And of course, prog can be a combination of those two things.
Absolutely. I use a lot of classical ideas when I write.
And other things as well. I can hear some jazzy things occasionally that you bring in, and it seems like there's a lot of influences that you've had over the years that you bring into the music. There is the possibility that you could take this and go on with another sequel.
Another sequel. So I just do the band question and then we'll come on to that.
Yeah, since this is a sequel, but it's a different band, could you take this particular thought and take it on further?
Oh, no, definitely not. Well, I hope not. I've got stories mapped out for 2 other sequels. So at the end of this album, I know what he does next. And then I've got a 3rd album where he does something else. So I've kind of got it mapped out. I've started writing quite a few of the songs. So I'm hoping I get a chance to make them. Whether it's just something I make for myself or whether I get to share it with the world, we'll just have to wait and see.
Will there be any live gigs?
I hope so, yeah. I mean, the album comes out next month. We'll just see how that does. Hope that people actually buy it and see if there's any appetite for that. But I'd love to. I've spent my last 30 years standing behind a keyboard. It sounds kind of fun to get out front and be behind the mic. So yeah, I hope so.
I was going to ask real quickly, is that strange for you not to, you said you're before an introvert, but is it strange to come out front now and sing?
I tell you what, when we made a video for the single, This Is Not a Test, that was kind of my first time seeing what it felt like to have the band behind me. And it was the weirdest feeling because all my life I've been able to see everybody. And because I'm normally the music director, I can always just check everyone's okay, make sure they're all happy. And now they're all behind me. I think, are they pulling faces? Have they run away? I've got no idea what's going on.
So you're not in control anymore.
No, you're the front man, and suddenly you've lost control. It seems
That's
like they're
it.
on. But no, it was
See,
cool. I really enjoyed it, and they're a great bunch of guys. So yeah, I'd love to get out and do some shows with them.
excellent. Richard West is the keyboardist and composer for Threshold and keyboardist, composer, and vocalist for Oblivion Protocol. The new album is Fall of the Shires. It will be released on August 18th. And I'm Mark Boardman. For all the latest music news, reviews, and interviews, go to Sonic Perspectives. Richard, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Hope you have a good one.